Hey everyone, you're listening to The Talent Revolution, where we believe that focusing on quality over volume and being different, not better, is the right way to hire the best humans and build stronger teams. To help you do this, I go behind the scenes with forward-thinking recruiters, employer brand experts, and people leaders making a huge difference to their organisations. I'm your host, Tom Hackwell, and in today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dan Keynes. Dan's currently Global Talent Acquisition Lead at Lumiere DX. He's been in the recruitment space since '99, starting out as an agency recruiter and then transitioning into the world of in-house recruitment with Sky in 2001. From there, he's moved through the corporate world into SMEs and then joined Lumiere DX at the startup stage. Dan's seen it all over the past 20 years and has leveraged that experience to help Lumiere DX scale hyper-fast, growing the team there from just under 300 when he joined in 2019 to over 1,500 today. We've got lots to learn and I'm keen to dig in, so thanks so much for your time, Dan.
No problem.
I think that if we start at the beginning, right, always really interested in understanding kind of what brought you to the HR space in the first instance. Like it looks like you started your career there, right? Like what drew you to the industry?
I think at the time I got a good opportunity to join Sky back in 2001, and it did look like I got a good opportunity, but recruitment was very different back then. It was very manual, it was very spreadsheet based, 120 roles handled, all that sort of stuff. But I think it was the opportunity to go in-house and actually make a difference to an individual company rather than do it from an agency perspective and sales perspective.
No, that makes perfect sense. We talked in the intro there about you joining Sky in 2001, right? Big company, very well-known brand. Like, what's your career journey look like in a bit more detail from that in 2001 through to today?
Yeah, so I think I've been through quite a number of organisations. So I mainly stayed in corporates, and actually Sky has seen me return to them 3 times actually. So I'm sure they probably won't have me back now. But actually, I've also been in financial services, sort of pensions, and then on to the bigger organisation at a later point. As I look at those corporates, I learned a lot through those around recruitment and how recruitment evolved, especially when I was at Sky, because we then started to go into social sourcing and all that sort of stuff, and starting to get a bit more data orientated and candidate experience orientated, employer brand, you name it, it's all the buzzwords. Then after my last big corporate role, I made a conscious decision that I wanted to go into smaller organisations. That started off with an IT consultancy that compared to the last place was much smaller at just sort of 12, 1500. And the reason for that move was because I wanted to be a bit closer to the bone, the commercials. So I wanted to understand how talent acquisition truly impacted a business from a commercial perspective, but also when you're in a smaller organisation, your small actions have a big impact on those that you're recruiting and the people in the business. And it gets you it gets you more creative when it becomes to talent acquisition, not just in the way you source, but the candidate journey, the recruiter journey, the hiring manager journey, the whole piece. I also found that smaller organisations took things a lot more personally, so it had a bit more of a family feel to it at the beginning. And I think from there you have more open discussions around what you can do, and they've got quite a vested interest. That was an SME, and then I went right into the startup zone, which is where I started off with Lumiere DX a couple of years ago. That was really interesting. I walked into a role where there was very little in place. But lots to do. So the first 3 months I was a hands-on recruiter because I didn't have a team. It was mental, I'm not going to lie, but if you look at what this organisation does, it was worthwhile. And actually I've been on quite a journey in 2 years and seen a big difference, and still massive changes happening now as the organisation grows and globalizes.
No, that's awesome, and I'm going to dig into all of those things, I think, over the next sort of half an hour. But I guess one question I had just right out of the gate, right? So you talked a lot about the transition from big co to small co and all of the really compelling reasons that kind of drove that move, all of which make loads of sense, right? I think you talked also a lot about the positives, right? More of a family-orientated atmosphere. People take things more personally. You're a bit more nimble. You're a bit closer to the bone. It all makes sense. Surely there were some negatives as well, or some challenges, though, with that kind of transition from bigger to smaller, right? Can you kind of piece them apart for me?
Yeah, when you're in a bigger corporate, it's funny because when I was in bigger corporates, I complained about all the systems and all the reporting and all the processes.
Yeah.
But when you haven't got them all, you complain about the fact you haven't got them all. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing, there's this, if you're in a really good HR or TA function, and Sky at the point when I was there was one of these, you don't realise the support you've got around you, because it's almost like this big machine where there's a lot of invisibles going on, and when you move away from it, you realise you haven't got that there. And I suppose the other big learning for me when it comes to challenge is the ambiguity, which everyone just calls strategy. But when you're with a bigger organisation, they've got a direction, they've got a vision, they know where they're going. These things tend to stay the same for a certain period of time. But actually, when you go into a small organisation, you have to start to create that yourself. So it's starting from that, I don't know to what should it look like, and then evolving it. So you've got to take quite an iterative approach to stuff. So that can be it's exciting, but it comes with a lot of pain and sometimes a fair few hours. So
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure.
yeah.
On the employer brand side, I mean, like, did you identify any big challenges there? Obviously, coming from places like Sky and some of the other bigger organizations you've worked with, everybody knows those brands, right? From a careers perspective, everybody understands the role they play in the market. When you move to the, the IT consultancy firm and now Lumiere DX with, I guess, comparatively unknown brands, did you have a completely different sourcing playbook, or did you kind of try and adopt the same approach?
I'm not going to lie and say I tried to adopt the same approach and failed.
But that's why I'm
miserably.
asking the question, right? Like,
So
it's interesting.
yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, when I joined the IT consultancy, the biggest mistake I made was to try and literally pull my experience from where I was successful at Sky and bring that into there. And I learned very quickly that not everywhere is Sky at that point, or whichever organization you've come from. I think from an employer brand perspective, when you work for a company that has a product brand, that drives a lot of brand loyalty, whether it's employer brand or purchasers, consumers, whatever. So that makes it easier. I think the big thing for me when I went into the IT consultancy and also with Lumiere DX, these aren't products that the consumer use. They're business to business. IT consultancy is a service provider that helps companies implement. So they're almost invisible to the outside world from that perspective. Lumiere DX, unless you're in the healthcare and medical diagnostics industry, no one really knows who you are. So you'd have to take a completely different track on that one. And some of that's about drip feeding through social media, speaking to networks, being a conscientious contributor to certain things like meetups and stuff like that. So, but with Lumiere DX, we're still on that journey, having done things like recently completed our EVP and stuff like that.
Cool. Let's dive into Lumiere DX then, because I think that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time today. Would love a bit of a primer on the business, right? Like, what's the founding story and what does the business do?
So the organisation was founded back in 2014 by three founders, Ron Zwenziger, Dave Scott and Jerry Macaulay. These three founders have got quite a big track record in medical diagnostics, stretching back decades. They'd set up previous companies such as Medisense, Inverness Medical, and the one that's probably well known in the industry called Alea, that's now part of Abbott. So their track record is pretty immense, and some of the things they've been involved in is pretty astronomical. When you look at what they've now, and by all means jump on our website, see a bit more about what it is, but they've basically invented a point of care platform that can measure multiple instances. So most point of care platforms will measure one thing, common ones like diabetes, flu, whatever. Our platform will measure multiple things. Obviously COVID's quite hot off the press, everyone knows about that. But not only that, it's portable, it's got connectivity, which means it can be used in settings, and we're in partnerships with people like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so it can be used out in developing and third world countries, and in a way that makes healthcare accessible for everyone, no matter what their backgrounds. So that gives you a bit of a view of where they've been, and obviously the organisation is one that's grown at pace really in all that time since it started in 2014 in probably a very small building somewhere with about sort of 5 to 10 people right the way to where we are now.
So talk to me about where you are now, right? So like, how big is the company today, and run me through the time between 2014 and today. Has it been like a really linear, slow and steady growth curve? Has it kind of exploded? What's that look like?
The beginning was probably, slow's not a word I'd put with Lumiere DX, if I'm being honest. So it's a positive thing. We move and change fast, which I'm sure every startup says. The organisation did start with a small number of people, and actually, to the credit of the founders, there are quite a number of managers that followed them from company to company. I don't know if that was a purposeful thing, but I'm going to take that as a positive reflection on them. So it did start as a small organisation that was very R&D driven, doing manufacturing of products once they went live. If I look at it, the easiest way, clearer way for me to put it is when I joined in September 2019, we were sitting at circa 300 people. And actually at that point, I think in 2019, we'd grown by something like 150 people in that 1 year, which was the biggest growth the organisation had seen at that point. And I was the sole recruiter, probably recruiting the last 50 odd of those in the last quarter of the year, which was with only a small ATS and not a great deal. So it was interesting, but it was good. What became very apparent, well, as you know, we got into the beginning of 2020, and organisations like this quite rightly take a bit of a breath in and say, right, where do we go next? And actually, they were working out the priorities. And then, unexpectedly, as it was for everyone, COVID-19 hit. Then the organisation really had to look at its situation, and it was all about what can we do to help the world on this, and they were really conscientious about that. So commercially they could have been rubbing their hands together, but the meetings I was in, you could tell that the founders were saying that we've got the tech, we've got the talent in the room. How do we actually help? And that meant we needed to scale the company up rapidly, really, really rapidly. So around about April last year, I got initial plans in. We had to grow by around about 300 odd at that point, very quickly. And got to remember at that point we didn't really have much in the way of processes and systems. So we have a basic ATS, which we still have now and will hopefully evolve, but a lot of our processes for selection were very manual. This is people that have been used to interviewing people face to face and doing assessment centres and all that good stuff, and we were going to have to flip that really quick. So that's what we did, and that basically took us to where we are now, and this will give you an idea of the scale. So we're sitting around about the sort of 1,500 mark at the moment globally. So the growth rate it's been probably bigger than I've seen in most organisations.
Yeah, I mean, like that's a heck of a lot of people to hire, but that's a heck of a lot of people to hire if you had 20,000 employees, right? No doubt. If you forgot you're tripling in size or doubling in size in a 12-month period, that's crazy. And kind of as you said, going from a standing start with simple systems and not a huge tech stack and a small team, it's a lot to accomplish, right? And I guess really keen to dig into how you did that in a minute. I think before we do that, though, a couple more questions just to kind of help set the tone for what the team looks like, right? What does your people team look like? How many of you are there? What's the structure of that team at the moment, etc.?
So it was interesting. That's had quite a growth as well, because it was 6 when I first joined back in 2019. But our SVP for People and Culture joined in September last year, so he's been here about a year, and we're now sitting around about 30 to 35 at the moment. So structure-wise, we have the SVP of People and Culture, and he has a leadership team which consists of all the COE leads. So that's including myself. I have a co-lead that helps out from a program management and strategy perspective. But we had a head of talent management, total reward. We also have a group of strategic HR business partners that obviously face off to the business, and a couple of sort of regional leads for places like the Americas and EMEA. So and all that's had to grow really quick. Don't forget Jill, head of our HR services. He has a phenomenal job because that's the machine room for HR, and all of that's had to grow pretty rapidly. So this team's probably been a lot of those were being recruited from sort of October, November onwards, with some of the recent starting as recently as June. So the team's not been together that long, but doing incredibly well. I'm going to say now, it's one of the things we were talking about in a team meeting. We've got so much to do, but there's absolutely no politics, and it's something that's quite refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, you've built a team in short order, and that team is performing clearly because you're scaling the business at the rate you need to be, which is a real testament to you all. I guess one final question before we start digging into the kind of generic stuff is, you talk a lot about tech and you talk about HR services and the sort of machine room for HR and all the functionality behind that. And I know you talked about an ATS and things like that before, but is there a specific piece of technology that you've rolled out across any aspect of the business that you think has been really, really supportive from a people perspective?
To be honest, when I first came in, they just rolled out an HRIS for the first time, quite a small scale one, really designed for SMEs at that point. And my colleagues that did a really successful job and got good adoption for that. I think other than that, the tech that we've rolled out so far hasn't been. We're now looking at other options for that as we grow, and potentially we will evolve that further. But where we have seen success is more around the sort of talent acquisition space, getting talent acquisition to use more online tools and the business to buy into that around things such as assessment, selection, usual stuff around headhunt and search, but also we're using tools now to map markets as well, which is helping inform, if we have got any problems with labour shortages and what we should do with that and locations we should look at, all that sort of thing. So they've been our real successes, but that goes back to my point earlier of sort of incremental change, and that's what we've really had to work on the basis of.
That's awesome. So again, we're going to dig into Lumiere DX in a minute, and you're going to give us a great case study on kind of what you've done over the past couple of years to achieve what you've done. I think before that, though, that there's a few kind of quick fire questions I want to ask everybody these days, right? And so first one, what's the main KPI you guys are measuring in the TA team right now? Like, what are you assessing yourselves against?
Well, it's hard to say a main one because we've got everything almost on a level pegging right now because we're developing everything. So there's the traditional the ones around time to hire and source a hire are in there, but the source hire is not just about cost and stuff like that. We're building the foundations to make sure we can build the data sets to understand what makes successful employees, and is a certain source result in more attrition or less attrition or that sort of thing. So I'm being a bit very vague and political here, but it's because of we're at that point. I think for us where the real importance is coming in right now, and I know this is something that you undoubtedly going to ask is around the inclusion piece. So we've grown rapidly as an organization from nothing to where we are so quickly, and now we're starting to build a picture of what our diversity and inclusion's looking like. That's then driven other things that we could be doing to help improve that and really form our view of what inclusion should be and is. So there, I would say that's the big thing at the moment around as far as data and reporting is concerned.
What's the kind of current split of agencies versus direct, right? Like when you're growing at that rate, are you outsourcing a lot of that acquisition or are you doing most of it in-house? What does that look like?
Well, we sort of, again, went on a bit of a journey. You're going to hear this a lot from me. So if I look at April last year, there was me and one recruiter in-house at that point. And when you've got that number of roles and not many automated systems, that's a lot to deal with. So what we then did was we basically pulled in, we got agreement from the board that we needed to spend on agencies. So at that point it was pretty hefty. I think by the end of last year, considering the number of roles, it wasn't as bad as I thought, but we ran about sort of 30 to 40% reliant on agencies. Fast forward that to now, beginning of the year, when we did another ramp up, that we actually brought in a small RPO to do a hybrid model, so in-house and RPO. So the RPO took on the sort of volume hiring. And as we sit here now, and part of this is down to the fact that we slowed some of our recruitment recently, we're now sitting at something like 15% agency reliance.
Brilliant. So, okay.
And
do you think that trend will continue, or are you thinking as you ramp hiring back up again, you'll kind of push back?
As we ramp higher, that will increase again. The aim is to try and keep it around about 20% or lower if we can. So this is where me and my partners in crime are about to lock ourselves in a room next couple of days to get ready for the next big ramp up.
Sure. And then the last kind of the generic questions is, what's the sort of biggest impact thing you've done on the candidate experience side, right? Like, big buzzword at the moment, everybody cares about candidate experience. Obviously you've got a multi-channel approach, but like what's the single thing that's moved the needle the most on the CE side?
I think it was take a more digital approach to the tools that we were using last year. Prior to last April, we had this very manual approach, which had people going through assessment centres or face-to-face interviews, and time to hire was massive at the time. So we've managed to over half that by using things like one-way video interviews, moving to Teams interviews, which you can set up quicker, and making sure that we've got SLAs in place for certain managers when we do campaigns and stuff like that. That reduced that time to hire massively. And I would say the biggest impact within that whole chain of events was when we introduced the one-way video interview, which really polarized opinions. I'm not going to lie about it. There's people out there said this is really impersonal. There's Dan recording himself asking questions where they're coming up in text, and a candidate's got to respond to them in a recording, and it polarized opinions of candidates as well. But the one thing you couldn't escape is in some of these volume areas or some of the roles where this was useful, it took away the need for a recruiter to do a full-on screen or a hiring manager to do a full-on screen. And the other result that we found was that for everyone that went through this one-way video interview, if you put it, the conversion from interview to offer was better than 1 in 2.
Interesting.
Which again shortened the time to hire completely, and the candidates were really starting to get really positive on their sort of experience with us. Are we there yet? No. Go back to the words I used before. We're still on that journey. So it's not as slick as some of the bigger forward-thinking tech companies, but we've definitely got it better than
No, that's awesome. And as you keep saying, right, it's about marginal gains, and you're continually rolling new stuff out, and that's awesome. But good to hear one-way video interviews making a difference, right? Like, I'm a big advocate of that sort of approach when you've got any form of volume to do, and I get why it's polarizing, but the data doesn't lie, does it? So no, cool. All right. Well, look, I think I want to dig into Lumiere DX because I just think there's so much we can learn from you there, right? So can you kind of take us on that journey, right? Take us from joining at the sort of 300 headcount stage, being tasked with hiring 50 people in that last quarter, being tasked with doubling headcount, at least initial plans was to double headcount the following year, but then actually that turned out crazy more. How have you used your time over the past sort of 18 months per se, right? Like, what does that look like?
The first 3 months, I made a conscious decision to really roll my sleeves up in a way that I hadn't done for a number of years before. So I was recruiting everything from, I suppose, entry-level packaging techs right the way up to senior roles for the first 3 months. And the reason I did it, it was tough. Hiring 50 roles in a period of 3 months and trying to keep agency spend and stuff like that down when it's just you is hard going. But actually, the reason I did it was not just because I like a challenge, because I do, but also so that I could get right under the skin of the business, and not just from a knowing the business perspective. It was knowing the stakeholders, understanding what makes them tick from a recruitment standpoint, and also starting to build at least a basic data set around how hiring was looking, so that we could make some decisions in 2020, which we did. If I go to the end of 2019, I then hired one person into my team, which was great. She was someone, and I hadn't poached her, I promised. She'd worked agency side, but had actually been recruiting for us for a number of years before. So she actually knew the business better than I did when she came in. Hurt. So it was a real positive. But the beginning of, luckily for us, beginning of 2020, the recruitment has slowed down a bit, as happens when you're in this startup environment. It suddenly peaks and drops and peaks and drops. So it gave us some time to really look at where we wanted to go, what we needed to do. But then, as I mentioned earlier on, COVID-19 hit. And I think at the time, if I'm being honest, the one recruiter I had in was a bit worried about what this situation would hold for us if things slowed down. But the penny drops that you're in a medical diagnostics company, and let's be honest, it's likely to go the other way, which it did. So the organisation, which had been primarily R&D driven at that point, the R&D was still there, but we were going to have to manufacture a product very quickly. It's no secret. What I did then was I worked with my manager at the time and the business to try and pull together as best plans as we could in the short period of time to understand what was coming. The tough bit was the business wasn't used to phasing, so it wasn't used to saying, right, I need so many here, so many here, so many here. Do you know what I mean? It was like, let's just get everyone in. And as happens with startups, typically once you get your roles approved, it's like horses out the traps, right? Everyone wants to go. So actually we did go through some pain points there, but eventually the business got really on board. One of the senior directors we were dealing with, that it was really impacting their area, really made sure that his managers were owning their own recruitment and were taking responsibility for it. So it wasn't just my show. And from there, we were able to course correct right the way through. Now, was it pretty? No, not at all. We implemented these new tools that I talked about earlier on. So that's the mapping tools, sourcing tools, one-way video interview, and we had a base ATS there. But we had to constantly change as we went through to improve things. There were times when it was horrible, there was times when it was great, and actually we achieved a lot in that period. Now what did happen was I got asked by the board, as we were looking at these online tools, what we would need to deliver at this pace, and that was where I went in with, right, these are the tools I need, but also this is the resource we need. So at that point I was able to grow the team by another 2 recruiters on the understanding we would still have a high agency reliance, and that at that point was another 350 to 500 roles, something like that. We finished most of that ramp up by about sort of November that year quite successfully, but then there was still loads more recruitment. And if you bleed that into this year, that then sees that growth, as I talked about, going from the 300 that I was in, the 300 headcount when I started, right the way up to where we are now, which is sort of circa 1,500. Now that headcount's not just within the UK, by the way. That's split across the main areas of the UK and US, but actually there's commercial teams split across the globe.
I mean, that's awesome, right? And so loads of things that you said there kind of get me thinking about questions. one of the things I wanted to kind of latch onto is you talked about the business transitioning from like, I guess, primarily R&D driven kind of experimental type organization through to something that's got to take a product out to market really quickly and ramp up manufacturing and distribution and all of these other things. I guess one of the things that, speaking to lots of TA people, I often find interesting is how do you sort of integrate yourself into the space and into the industry and understand where that talent lives and how to speak to it and how to sell the opposition? Do you know what I mean? Like you talk about essentially building, not talking for you, but building that kind of manufacturing and distribution channel within the business. How did you kind of learn where to go spend time with those people?
That's a really good question. So if I take this in two stages, so the first ramp up that I did April last year, that was a tough gig because we had to just hit the ground running with that one. So we were very dependent on the message that went out via agencies, plus the person that was in my team and myself were sort of piling stuff out on LinkedIn and social media as much as we could because we didn't have too many sort of formal channels on that front. That seemed to work quite well and really basic, but it worked. And we also got people within the organisation to start to refer people they knew. So it was all about, and I learned this at the IT consultancy, sometimes the worst thing you can do is go big bang on your brand and here we are and this is who we're going to recruit. And the nature of our business, they're not like that either. So actually it sort of became a bit more about word of mouth, drip feeding brand into the industry that we're in, working with our third party suppliers to see how they can help us do that as well, because we just didn't have that capability at that point. Fast forward to now, I mentioned that we went down the hybrid model of an RPO and in-house. Got a team that are a lot more established, that know how to use social media, working with marketing. So we did things like improve our careers page. We're working on that again now that we've sort of evolved that further. There's a lot more discussion around social media and how we use that. Our marketing team got really on board really quickly and started to, just even from a product perspective, started to liven up our social media pages and change the website and all that stuff. Between that and some of the stuff we were doing with the RPO really started to blow the doors open a bit more. Again, we're not there yet. It's an ongoing journey. But the thing we had to do, and I think I go back to my point earlier on, if you're not a product brand in a sense of a consumer brand like a Sky or whatever else, no, I think you need to go out with your brand a bit differently, because if you go big bang, people are just going to ignore it because it's just another bit of noise in their social media. So it's about understanding what messages you want to put out and how you want to put them out.
Makes a lot of sense. I think another question I had, so you mentioned COVID, and obviously that's had a massive, I guess, positive impact on the Lumiere DX, which is great. Not necessarily true of many other industries and many other sectors, sadly. Do you find that a lot of the folks that you hired over the past, let's say since the beginning of 2020, were already in the sort of medical diagnostics industry, or on the periphery are a lot of these people moving into the sector from external sectors? And if so, have you found yourself sort of like not just selling the business and the employer brand, but also selling the industry as a whole? Like what does that look like for you?
Last year, we were trying to get as many people from either medical diagnostics or related industries, so pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, that sort of stuff that have the same regulations, or for the roles in manufacturing, for example, such as packaging techs or production technicians. If they hadn't come from medical diagnostics, they've come from regulated industries, so they understand that if they want to change something, they can't just change it. They've got to do go through certain steps. So there was a bit of variance at that point. I think going to manufacturing, we did open it up quite a bit and say that you didn't need to have medical diagnostics or even healthcare experience. It was a big plus, but you didn't have to have it. If you've come from an environment where there's a real structured approach to change and to how you do it, and you need to be very conscientious about what you do, that's what matters. Obviously, when you look at other areas within our business, such as quality and regulatory, these people need to really come from diagnostics or pharmaceuticals. It's like the compliance of the medical diagnostics world. I'm sure my colleagues wouldn't appreciate that, but it's what keeps the conscience right. It's what gets us what we need from a regulatory perspective. And then when you look at the lab side, the scientists and lab technicians, a lot of our lab technicians might have come out of uni or only had a small amount of time in a lab. They didn't need to be medical diagnostics. They just needed to understand how a lab ran. And the more junior scientists, quite similar. There's certain roles that were more specialist than others, but we could be here all day if I went into that. I think the real key change, when I first came in, I think ideally they were looking for a recruitment manager that had come from a healthcare environment. I think they realised pretty quickly that actually they were limiting their opportunities there. So from a support function perspective, we tend to bring people in from, I mean, if I look at the HR team right now, the diversity in where people have come from ranges from academia to startups to big corporates, with only a handful coming from that sort of healthcare background, and I think that's generally been the attitude for most of the sport.
Yeah, and that was kind of why I asked the question. It just seems like an impossible task to find that many people, all with relevant sector experience and things like that. But it just, I guess, changes the dynamic of how you position the employer brand if they don't have that.
Yeah, but where we were quite lucky, our organisation, because they're quite, I keep using the word conscientious, but I've spoken to our founders a couple of times. And in fact, one of the founders was in my interview and he sold the dream to me. And it wasn't a dream, it was reality. And you've only got to look at what we're trying to do, and people can see that and go, I want to be part of that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's and that I think in itself, is it an dead easy sell? No, it's an easier sell because of what you're selling is a good concept. It's going to make a big difference.
That's it. You guys seem to have a distribution challenge, right? Like your messaging is on point. It's just about getting in front of as many people as possible. Whereas I think we see a lot of organizations with the exact opposite problem, where they have that reach maybe because they are a consumer brand or otherwise, but the messaging is not resonating with anybody, and they're really kind of struggling to undo the negative perception of their brand in the marketplace. And so it's just interesting to kind of sort of deconstruct how you guys have got to where you have, but it's awesome. I think from my perspective, what was the biggest, what was the most unexpected challenge, I guess, of scaling the business up so swiftly, right? You've worked for big companies, you know what it's like for an organization that looks at 1,500 people. Over the past sort of 2 years, what's been the thing that's been sort of most difficult?
Starting from a standing start, I think is the key. That might sound like the obvious, but I think the most difficult here is there wasn't like lots of forward planning. That's got better, by the way, and that's something that's massively improved. But if I look at those first ramp ups, it was a matter of weeks, and you had a spreadsheet in front of you with a big plan, and that was the tough gig. And I'm not gonna lie, in some of the corporates they're like that as well. I've experienced that in the corporates, but they've at least got the infrastructure, the employer brand, and everything they could start to kick off. We didn't have that, so the most challenging thing was that, and then trying to get the business on side with what talent acquisition could look like. So I think that the way I overcame that, and I go about incremental adjustments. We had candidates going through more assessments than I probably would have liked at the beginning for some of the more sort of manufacturing roles. But actually, what it started to do with the business, it started to breed behaviours. So they started to understand, well, actually, maybe we don't need that, and actually, we've got to start to take this approach. So instead of it being just Dan saying you must, or HR saying you've got to, it was almost a bit of a voyage of discovery for the hiring managers as well, which was slightly purposely orchestrated to breed behaviours, if I'm being honest. I'm not going to say it was perfect. I learned a lot myself. I definitely didn't get it right all the time. But I think that was the way I overcame that challenge, because when we went into the phase 2 ramp up, people were then used to it and it made more sense to them. And, and next time we have a ramp up, we'll do it better again. So again, do you know what I mean? So we're constantly looking at ourselves and saying, what went well, what didn't go well, and what it's doing is driving us towards that. I'd love to say utopia. I don't think you ever really quite get there, but it definitely to a better place anyway.
Cool. Look, 2 final questions to kind of wrap this up, right? One looking backwards and one looking forwards, right? So this is a kind of cliche question, but given everything you've just said and kind of looking back over the past sort of 24, 30 months, what would you do differently knowing what you know now if somebody had said to you, look, the company's going to be 1,500 people in 2.5 years?
Data.
Sure.
That's probably the one. Okay, so it sounds dead dull and very dry, but the one thing this organisation's taught me, and I was always aware of it and always did it before, but I think if I could have, and it's not even a crystal ball, if I could have built a view of how the company, no one could have predicted COVID, no one, that threw everyone off, but actually if I could have predicted an element of the growth, learned a bit more about what's going on under the skin to understand how the organisation was going to drive, then maybe I could have pushed better for planning and start to understand that, because I actually think that would have got us into a more comfortable position before ramp ups and stuff like that happened. I think the other thing is I did pull together some basic data off that first 3-4 months of being in the business. But looking back now, I probably could have had richer data that I could have built upon and started to look at what systems I could use to make that happen. So they're probably the biggest learnings for me. So if I could do it differently, that would be it. Because when you look at all the rest of the shiny tech and all the rest of it, that comes along when you've got the data to back it up.
No, and I mean, you're practicing, singing from the same hymn sheet as me on that one. Frankly, I can't operate without data. I think it's crucial. I think I said a lot. I said I was going to ask you 2 questions. I just want to ask you one more actually. So 3 total.
Okay.
You talked a little bit, maybe 10 minutes ago, about how the first 3 or 4 months in the role you spent kind of in the weeds, right? Having those conversations, doing the manual recruitment, and you gave some really valid reasons as to why you did that, right? But I guess what I'm interested is lots of people don't do that, and I think it's commendable that you did. Yeah. What's the kind of biggest takeaway that you learned, or the biggest thing that you identified that you feel like you would have missed had you not done that kind of in the weeds recruiting yourself?
I think it goes back even more basic than this. And me and a couple of people in the networks that I'm in, we've discussed this a lot. There's going to come a time when I need to be hands off, but I'm also a big believer that if you're managing a TA team, a TA process, and you're trying to influence a business, you need to be able to apply your trades. You actually know what's going on within those markets. I had to learn this market. I'd never been in life sciences before, so the first 2 months might as well have been speaking to me in a different language. Although if you asked them the question, they geeked out at you. It was great. But the thing for me, I think, if you're in a role at this level and you can't apply that trade, you don't know what it is that's going to help that business from a TA perspective. Same as when I eventually built that team up now, and it's still building, they're all coming into an industry that's quite new to them, or, it's fast moving. It's a different environment. Some have come from corporates, and all of a sudden we're saying, forget your base level knowledge is great and we'll use that, but forget everything you knew before. Sure. This is different. So I'm able to then be in their shoes, help coach, mentor them, move them a certain direction. Our biggest win from a team knowledge perspective is they're starting to become much more data driven. And I think if I had not done that in that first 3 months, I would have not understood the business, although it changes so often that easily goes out of date. I would have not understood what made the managers tick and the motivations for it, and I wouldn't have understood what was going to make recruitment work in Lumiere DX, but also the markets around it. So that are the key things, and it's the reason why I'm still managing a small workload of recruitment.
That's a great answer, and really, really helpful. My final question then, looking forward a bit, if I came along as like the magic recruitment budget fairy and doubled your budget tomorrow, what would you spend the extra money on?
My boss is listening to this bit. I think for me, it's systems orientated. So now we do use a basic, from an HRIS perspective, HR systems. It's actually very basic. It's very good, very intuitive, but the recruitment system's not quite so good. So where would I spend my money? It goes a couple of ways. So one, it will make sure that we've got the systems and tech that we need to be able to have that data coming out of it, make the lives of the recruiters and HR easier. But then there's a couple of other things that needs to come into that, and that's also the hiring. So I look at the journeys not just from a candidate experience, but from a recruit experience, hiring manager experience as well. But also the data piece is really important to me, and there's a number of reasons for it. One, those systems can plow out data as long as you're putting the right things in around your inclusion at each stage of the recruitment process, what your bottlenecks are, what are the issues are, what things do we need to change and course correct, or use the phrase again, but also what strategies do we need to put in place. And I think once you've got those systems in, and that's really, if you'd come to me with a big budget back in September 2019 or even April last year, that's what I would have wanted, because the implementation would have been painful, the money would have been big, but it would have been worth the investment, because the journey after that would be so much
And
better.
Do you think there's a time in the journey that doesn't make sense, or is it always better to take that pain now? You talk about implementation of systems being expensive and painful. Like, is there a time and a place for that, or is it just always your kind of fundamental belief is like systems reign true and you need to have the best ones?
your processes shouldn't be driven by systems. And I think as a startup, been in startups, that's one thing I've really realised. And actually, if you end up with a big enterprise system, sometimes I've seen organisations be driven by the system limitations, not by their own thinking. So, in straightforward answer to yourself, I don't think there is an easy. I think the challenge is always there. Where we've got to now, and this is probably the right way. We're starting to get the data now. I'm sitting down with a colleague on Friday to plough through that data, build that journey, and go, right, this is the tech we're going to need. So I can go to my boss and say, now's the time. Do you know what I mean? We've gone through all this. We've got the data. This is what it's telling us, and therefore these are the right systems we need to have. And we build a roadmap. So it's not everything in one go. You build a roadmap to do that that continuous improvement. So that, I don't know if that really answers your question, but for me, I don't think there is a right time. You've just got to build that picture and understand. Selfishly, I would have loved something that could just plug in and go, like that, but it doesn't work that way. So so that's the reason why I don't think there's ever a right time. It's just a case of finding when that right time is, and for us, I think that's coming.
Awesome. Well, look, I think that's a great place to round out, and just leaves me to say thank you. I think everybody's going to have learned a great deal from that, myself included. So yeah, thanks very much for your time. I think for everybody listening, we've obviously learned a load about Lumiere DX today, and it sounds like an epic place to be. And like the old saying, if you get offered a seat on a rocket ship, don't ask which seat, just get on the bloody ship, has never seemed truer, right? So if you're interested in an opportunity there, check out their careers page at lumieredx.com/careers. And I think, for more great tales from the trenches and best practice guidance, stay tuned to the Talent Revolution. We've got more great guests like Dan coming every Tuesday. Go ahead and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening.